Welcome to the STEM Confidence Podcast, where we talk about how to turn your data into powerful insights. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the STEM Confidence Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about how to present your work in a way that is efficient, enjoyable, and engaging both for you and your audience. I want to share with you 5 tips that will help you prepare your next presentation. So if you are the kind of person that has a presentation due and you are already stressed out about how to prepare it, this episode is for you. If you know everything in theory, but when it actually comes to preparing it, you get super stressed out and then you procrastinate until it's eventually too late, which makes you even more stressed out. So if you recognize yourself in this description, keep on listening. However, I want to start by telling you a story, and I'm sure that what I'm about to tell you happened to you many times. So recently, I was attending a conference and one of the main speakers was giving their talk. Since it was one of the main speakers, the expectations were pretty high. But once it started, it became clear that I would struggle a lot to keep up with their talk. The speakers seemed to be speaking to themselves. The tone of the presentation was very weak and the overall talk lacked clarity. The slides were those typical densely packed slides with many words, many diagrams, and many figures, which eventually make you lost in the presentation. So, of course, needless to say that I lost interest within minutes, and I noticed I wasn't alone. Of course, the audience slowly but surely began to shut down. So if you ever found yourself on a conference and wondering, what is this person talking about? This episode is for you. I want to share 5 tips that I use whenever I have to present my work. Tip number 1 is to know your audience. I know it seems obvious that you would not talk the same way to for example, 5-year-old and to an expert in your field, but for some reason, people really tend to underestimate this. And this is probably because we have a tendency to think that everyone knows everything about the topic we are talking about. Especially if you've been in your field for a long time, it is very easy to assume that everyone is familiar with the subject you're discussing. The next time you're about to prepare your slides or your talk, think about what is your audience here for. Did they come to learn something? Did they come to get more information about the topic? Or the purpose of the talk is just to inform them? Whatever information you decide to put in your talk, ask yourself the following questions. What do I want my audience to get from this slide? Does this specific diagram have a purpose? What does this sentence, slide, or figure do for my audience? If you don't have a clear answer to these questions, there might be 2 reasons for that. The first one is that the mentioned element simply doesn't provide any value, and it is maybe better to rethink whether it is worth including it in your talk. The other reason is because it might be in the wrong place in the presentation. This brings me to tip number 2, which is to follow a clear storyline. This one is really, really important. It is essential to avoid constantly introducing new subjects and topics. Make sure that your presentation has a storyline that is logical, that makes sense, and most importantly, that is easy for your audience to follow. I'm sure you've experienced this many times. You start by understanding the talk, and then at some point, you simply lose the line, and then you're completely unable to understand the speaker until the end. This happens because the storytelling had some gaps and your brain was not able to connect 2 pieces of information, even if you were listening very carefully. I believe this tip is crucial since it can really make or break your presentation. And when this happens, the audience tends to shut down immediately. Remember that everyone loves a good story, and it is much easier to follow a story than a bunch of facts or data that are just thrown directly onto the slides and to the audience. To that end, keep in mind how important it is to follow a clear storyline and to know exactly what comes where in your presentation. Tip number 3 is to give examples. I think this is definitely one that people don't use enough. Giving examples is a great way to make your audience connect with the topic you're talking about. Also, remember that the more basic the example is, the better. You should think about an example that is familiar and that everyone could relate to. By doing so, you make sure that everyone understands your point, which is kind of the whole point and the whole purpose of your presentation. So next time when you're not sure how to explain something, just try to give an example of it. A comparison to some familiar situation might also work in these cases. Actually, some time ago, I was listening to a talk in which the speaker was explaining some very specific traits related to complex networks. And what I really liked about that presentation is that they were constantly comparing those complex networks and interactions with people connecting via Facebook. This is a very good way to break the technical specificities and actually find a common ground for people to stand on. Also, it prevents people from getting lost in your talk, which is exactly what we don't want. So if at some point you realize that your talk is becoming too difficult to follow for your audience, or if you start noticing that your audience is slowly shutting down, just try to give an example, and you'll see how people will instantly follow much better. And most importantly, don't be afraid of using simple language. Believe me, the simpler, the better. Usually we tend to think that the more complex the words, the smarter we'll seem, but it's actually the opposite. Remember that your expertise comes from knowing how to explain complex stuff in the simplest possible way, not from making simple stuff even more complicated. This actually brings me to tip number 4, which is probably one of my favorite ones. Tip number 4 is called the sandwich method. I'm not sure when was the first time I learned about this method, probably sometime at the beginning of my PhD, but I really liked it and I use it all the time, whether I'm teaching or just giving a talk. The sandwich method has 3 parts and goes like this. Tell the audience what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. We know that repetition is the mother of all knowledge, so we want to make sure that your audience is exposed to your topic many times. And by applying this method, you're helping them to follow your point and then actually understand it. And the 5th and last advice I have for you is to choose the keywords of your talk. The best way to do so is to choose between 3 and 5 keywords and repeat them consistently throughout your talk. The easiest way to choose them is to ask yourself what are the main ideas that you would like your audience to remember once they leave the talk. I'm sure you've seen the take-home message slide many times, but a common mistake is not to connect these messages to the keywords of the talk, which eventually makes the presentation messy and difficult to follow. And finally, it is very important to remember that these pieces of advice work synergistically, meaning that they perform best when considered together. But if they are actually considered, I promise they will work wonders. So, use these 5 tips when preparing for your next talk and see how it goes. I'm sure it will be great, both for you and for your audience. Thank you for listening, and until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you are ready to elevate your communication skills and transform your data into valuable insights, schedule a free discovery call on the link in the description.